Chapter 8. Lord Henry's thread said he had the bread to splash around, though in this time it wasn't that hard to know what was cool, so Prudence wasn't impressed. What he couldn't buy was the bill to be boss. He was a black scarecrow, with his stick arms making awkward lines and angles. Even the sassy cane looked out of whack. He was a bit too everything for the shabby drawing room, and his arrival had thrown her off balance enough to let the slang creep in. She tried to get her head into 1905 while he did the polite greater to lowers bow, first to her and then to Ernest. The way he looked at Ernest was a bit too cranked, well, she didn't know what they called it in this time. Crazy maybe, or unnaturally excited. Whatever it was called, it kinda creeped her out. But his lack of distinguishing attention to her gave her time to eyeball him. Goodness, the guy was downright hideous. Oily, coarse nest on top of that misshapen head. Hair sticking out in all directions. Pocked skin and a nose and mouth in fierce competition for ugliest. With his ears edging into a close third. He was kind of a caricature of himself, one that had accidentally come to life. Dr. Masterson thought you might be here, Dr. Warren. He paused, letting his gaze trail briefly around the space, arching his brows just a bit, as if he wanted to ask why but was too polite to do it. His accent was upper-class British. I am pleased he was correct. And apparently, the doc had a crystal ball. If Masterson had sent Lord Henry here, anyone with money could follow the crumbs between Ernest and Dr. Masterson. It was the same calling card she'd used. Copycat. So far she wasn't buying what he was selling. Significant to her, without offering clarity, there'd been no sign of a Lord Henry around the other iterations. Didn't mean there was something wrong with the guy, even if she really wanted to think there was. Cat could be creepy without being creepy. Ernest stared at him for several seconds and then muttered, "The storm?" He gestured vaguely toward the gulf. He opened his mouth, probably to ask how either man could have known he'd be here, but closed it, most likely caught in the 1905 manners trap. Prudence would have liked to know too. She hadn't told Masterson where she planned to set up shop. As if he'd become aware of her, Lord Henry looked her direction, and she discovered there was one thing about him that wasn't ugly. His eyes. Though cavernously deep-set and dark, there were lights in there that were kind of mesmerizing. They saw what they looked at, which eyes didn't always do, particularly when directed toward women in this time. Or her time, she reminded herself a bit wryly. There was a fathomless quality to them, leaving her the sense that if she looked long enough and hard enough, she might learn something. Maybe something amazing. Find out deep secrets. Become better. She felt herself leaning and rocked on her heels. That woke her up. She dropped her lids over her eyes and took a couple of deep breaths, her clasped hands tightening briefly. The dizziness faded. The wood beneath her feet firmed once more. Carefully, cautiously she raised her lids, though not all the way up. Lord Henry extended a claw-like hand her direction, giving Ernest a look of inquiry. Ernest jerked at this nudge to his manners, but Prudence beat him to it, the instinct to hide her true name well honed by her many-dimensional transits. That she'd told this Ernest her real name was another protocol breach, but she hadn't thought it would matter. Prunella Smith. Lord Henry had his eyes on Prudence, so he missed Ernest's jerk. Prudence stifled a sigh. He was brilliant but not subtle. Prudence let the clammy claw close round her hand. At least his slight bow gave her break from the eyeballs. The small shift of air brought her the scent of him. The first wave was pleasant, but the follow-on, not so much. It wasn't bad enough to repel, but there was something about it that made the hairs on her arms lift. She didn't like him, so it wasn't easy to decide if that made him dangerous or just one of those guys women didn't like, well, because he made a great alternative to Ernest as the bad guy. No wonder they didn't want agents to get emotionally involved. Please, she gestured toward a wooden chair next to a small couch. Won't you be seated? She clasped her hands back together and added, hoping it didn't sound too afterthought-ish, Can I get you some refreshment? Geez, she hoped he said no. Though maybe one of the automatons would know how to manage that? Lord Henry sank gracefully onto the wooden seat, one hand still clasping the cane, but shook his head. No, I thank you. Something in the way he glanced around seemed to hint that he couldn't imagine good refreshment in this place. He had a point. Even the water was on the brackish side. With a look at her, Ernest went to the bench. She followed him, and they sank down together. The silence grew slowly awkward. Prudence liked awkward silences. There were things to be learned in them if one didn't get sucked into awkward. Ernest didn't love it. She knew that without looking at him. Lord Henry didn't like it, but didn't seem to fear it. She could almost see wheels turning inside those eyes, his brain searching for a way past the current impasse, without him being the one to give ground. Lord Henry finally cleared his throat, as if acknowledging someone had to speak. Shifting slightly so that he faced them more fully, he said, "I am glad you made it safely ashore, Doctor." "Thank you." As if even Ernest realized this was not enough, he added, "I was rather concerned." Another pause. And relieved. To make it, I mean? Not a great example of clever, though ultimately just as unrevealing. Prudence had to lower her lashes quickly and keep a firm grip on her lips to hold back the grin. "I understand you spent some time with my expedition while you were in Egypt?" I found them they were most kind." A very slight smile curved the edges of Lord Henry's thin mouth. "I believe you were the one who was kind. They were in need of resupply. I am grateful for the assistance you provided." A pause. "And I am grateful you did not mention my involvement. Your discretion is most appreciated. When it is known that one is willing to fund expeditions." He made a gesture with his hands that seemed to say he'd like to fund them all, but couldn't. "I imagine they didn't." Lord Henry held up a hand. "Cleveland was worried, but I assured him that I did not mind you knowing. In fact, I am most interested in your researches, Doctor. I have my ticket for your presentation at the Institute." He moved the cane to a position between his legs, resting both hands on the head. Between his hands the silver gleamed, something that could have been beak or possibly a muzzle stuck out of the gap created by his palms. Did she see jeweled eyes? Okay, her imagination might be running a bit wild. Prudence felt the slight withdrawal from Ernest at the mention of the Institute. Lord Henry saw it too. "You are going to speak, are you not?" With an effort, Ernest nodded. "Of course. I just wonder how useful my research is." His voice trailed off, and his focus shifted as the scientist came forward. He looked toward the gulf, toward the incoming storm. Lord Henry's eyes gleamed. Was it her overactive imagination that the canehead's eyes did too? "So the storm you ran into was the storm?" Ernest still resisted. It showed in the tightening around his mouth, but he admitted, it did exhibit some unusual features. Lord Henry leaned slightly forward, the knuckles of his hands turning white. "I've read about it, but have not yet experienced this storm." "Stick around," Prudence wanted to tell him, even though she didn't want him to stick around. "You may have the opportunity," Ernest said, "if it persists on its current course. Though from what I've read, it can dissipate quite suddenly and without warning." Lord Henry leaned back again, with an effort at calm, or so it seemed to her. "Yes, I have heard this as well." He too looked in the direction of the gulf. His gaze returned to them, tracking between them as if trying to figure out their relationship. He looked at Ernest. "I had come to offer Dr. Warren a share of my modest hospitality." There was a hint of a question in the comment, but also some irony, Prudence noted, fighting a grin once more. It would be hard to get more modest than this. It is most kind, but..." Ernest shifted on the wooden bench. "It's very hard to separate Dr. Warren from his airship," Prudence said, "to help him out, and to add an element of respectability to the situation. Not as much as Ernest would have liked, but as much as she could give him. Though I believe he was glad to have a break from sea rations. Ah, Lord Henry relaxed some, which was interesting. Why did he care? The air in the room was thick with nuances and tension and questions. All kinds of crap. So much it was hard to sort through. There was menace in there too, but she wasn't sure it came from Lord Henry or the storm tracking so steadily toward them. When do you think the storm will arrive? If it does, Lord Henry amended. Ernest hesitated, a frown creasing his brows. Possibly by morning. Lord Henry rose, prompting them to rise as well. Then, with your permission, Miss Smith, I would like to return in the morning? I can imagine no greater pleasure than experiencing it with a scientist of Dr. Warren's caliber. Prudence did not want to be here to greet the storm, didn't want to face it with those eyes watching her, but what could she say? She glanced at Ernest, then managed a polite smile. Of course, sir. We'd be pleased to have you join us. You've been listening to Specters in the Storm by Pauline Baird Jones. Copyright by Pauline Baird Jones. All rights reserved.